risk management techniques, non-insurance methods. This is what we're going to be covering, and we'll move on. So basically, after identifying and evaluating exposures to risk, consideration can now be given to alternative methods for managing each exposure. There's 4 basic methods available for handling risks, which are risk avoidance, loss control, risk retention, and risk transfer. So a conscious decision not to expose oneself or one's firm to a particular risk is what risk avoidance is. It can be said to decrease one's chance of a loss to zero. For example, the eccentric chief executive of a multi-billion-dollar firm may decide not to fly to avoid the risk of dying in an airplane crash. A doctor may decide to leave the practice of medicine rather than contend with the risk of malpractice liability losses. Risk avoidance is common, particularly among those with a strong aversion to risk. However, avoidance is not always feasible. So if you imagine that you're scared of getting food poisoning, would it be feasible to say you're never going to eat again? Probably not. So avoidance is not always feasible, and it may not even be desirable, even if it is possible. So for example, you may decide to stop practicing medicine to avoid risk, but that may not actually be desirable. When risk is avoided, the potential benefits as well as the cost are given up. So loss control, when particular risk cannot reasonably be avoided, actions may often be taken to reduce the losses associated with them, and that's known as loss control. It is different from risk avoidance, as in loss control. Number one, the firm or individual is still engaging in operations that give rise to particular risks, and also it involves making conscious decisions regarding the manner in which those activities will be conducted. Let's look at the focus of loss control. Some loss control measures are designed primarily to reduce loss frequency, like the number of times claims occur, and that's called frequency reduction. For example, when a company cleans up its storage areas and discards the oily rags previously stored there, it is practicing loss control designed to lessen the chance that the firm will suffer like a fire or something like that. The oily rags are going to exacerbate the costs and everything associated with a fire. But here they're actually trying to avoid them. Some firms spend considerable funds in an effort to reduce the frequency of injuries to its workers. So there's useful to consider the classic domino effect that was put forward by H.W. Heinrich, which we're going to look at in a moment. So loss control, focusing on this domino theory. So there's basically 5 steps to the domino theory, which you see here. So in a couple of slides time, 2 or 3 slides time actually, there's going to be a little bit more in-depth explanation of this. But basically, the 5 steps are 1, hereditary and social environment, 2, personal fault, 3, an unsafe act or the existence of a physical hazard, 4, an accident, 5, injury. And basically, when these things take place in sequence, the final part of it is an injury, and what basically happens with an injury, that's going to cause your losses. But if any of the steps 1 through 4 are taken out of the picture, then you're not going to get to the point where you get an injury and losses. It's often argued that the emphasis of loss control should be put on the 3rd domino, that 3rd point in there, which is an unsafe act or the existence of a physical hazard. And I believe that's because that's the one it's most easy to deal with. In a few slides time, when we actually see this list of 5 effects in in more detail, then at that point it may make a little bit more sense what we're saying now. So these are the dominoes, and this is the 5 dominoes. And then let's move on to an example. Which domino does Heinrich's domino theory suggest is the most important to focus on in reducing the frequency of workplace injuries? And it's basically the third one, the one in the middle. This is the unsafe act or physical hazard. It's the third domino. But let's move on to look at a little bit more detail into what Heinrich's model actually says. So domino 1 is ancestry and the worker's social environment, which impact the worker's skills, beliefs, and or traits of character, and that's the way in which they perform tasks. So it's kind of difficult to change the stuff that's put in under the first step. The second step, the worker's carelessness or personal faults, which lead them to pay insufficient attention to the task. So again, it's going to be fairly difficult to change. But step 3, or domino 3, an unsafe act or mechanical physical hazards such as a worker error, etc. Those step 3 is probably easier to actually deal with. And if we actually look at the diagram on the next slide, if you don't intervene, each of those steps in tune is going to lead to an injury at the end, and that's going to lead to losses. Whereas you can see in the second diagram that the domino, if the third domino is removed, and even if the first 2 things occur, then you're still going to get through to the 4th or even the 5th, the important domino where you get injury and loss. And as I say, it's my belief that the third domino is going to be the easiest one to impact on, because if you look back, what is the third domino? The third domino is unsafe act or mechanical physical hazard, etc. The first 2 is basically character traits and the way somebody is. They're much harder things to actually deal with and change. So let's move on, and we're continuing on with focus on loss control. Severity reduction. This is a generic term for a method of loss control that will reduce the seriousness and extent of damage should a loss occur. So it's not the number of losses, it's really like the size of the loss. So the example we have here is an auto manufacturer having airbags installed in the company fleet of automobiles. The airbags will not prevent accidents from occurring, but they will reduce the probable injuries that employees will suffer if an accident does occur. There are 2 specific forms of severity reduction. The first one is separation, and the second one is duplication. With separation involves the reduction of the maximum probable loss by isolating loss exposures from one another. You can minimize the adverse effects of a single loss. For example, storing inventory at 2 separate warehouses instead of having them in one warehouse minimizes the loss if one facility is destroyed. The second point there, duplication. Spare parts or supplies are maintained to replace immediately damaged equipment and or inventories. You can, for example, store information on a backup server to use if the original server fails. So duplication, another form of duplication would be that you have a machine and you have spare parts for it. So if it breaks, you can actually get it up and running. So you already have the spare parts there readily available. It's interesting to consider that duplication actually increases the maximum possible loss, because duplication often increases risk. And how can it do that? Well, the way it does it is that if you've got a machine and it stops working, then that machine often will bear no more risk because it's not working. And if you have spare parts to get it up and running again, then the risks associated with that machine are back up and running. So let's look at an example. Storing inventory in 2 different physical locations is an example of separation is the answer. So loss control, 3 timing classifications that we've got here for loss control. So some loss control methods are implemented before any losses occur. So the first in the list here is the pre-loss activities. So these are implemented before any losses occur. All measures with a frequency reduction focus, as well as some based on severity reduction, are of this type. So for example, suppose you've got an employee safety education program that is designed to actually reduce both the frequency and severity of injuries to workers. So before any loss occurs, you train your staff up so they're fully aware of how to perform their tasks safely. That's going to be an example of pre-loss activity. 2, concurrent loss control. So these are activities that take place concurrently at the same time with losses to reduce the severity. So an example is if you've got sprinkler system in your company, there's a fire, the sprinkler comes on at the same time as the fire to extinguish the fire. Now, of course, you can say, well, we actually installed the sprinkler system before the fire. That's fine. But they actually the working of the sprinkler system is at the time of the fire, so it's concurrent. And then post-loss activities always have a financial severity reduction focus. So one example is trying to salvage damaged property rather than discard it. So an example of that would be the partial restoration of a wrecked car and subsequent sale can reduce overall severity. So if there's a car that's been in an accident and it's a total write-off, the car's totaled, you can actually fix it and sell it, so you can add value to it. So that's a post-loss activity. The loss has taken place and now you're stepping up to try and claw some money back for it. So let's look at an example. Which of the following would be an example of pre-loss loss control method? So salvage would not be pre, that would be after. And safety training of employees would be pre-loss. And so the answer is going to be B. And it's not going to be C because that says following an injury. So following an injury is not going to be a pre-loss. So let's now look at decisions regarding loss control. A major issue for risk managers is the decision about how much money to spend on the various forms of loss control. In some cases, it may be possible to significantly reduce the exposures or the exposure to some types of risk. But if the cost of doing so is very high relative to the firm's financial situation, then the loss control investment may not be money well spent. So the general rule to justify the expenditure is that the expected gains from any investment in loss control, the money you spend on loss control, should be at least equal to the expected cost. So basically, the benefit should outweigh the cost. So let's look at the potential benefits. Many of the benefits are either readily quantifiable or can be reasonably estimated. These may include the reduction or elimination of expenses associated with those following items that we have there in the list. So potential benefits of loss control. The first one we have there is repair or replacement of damaged property. So you're going to eliminate, there's going to be an elimination because you've got loss control, so you're not having to repair or replace damaged property because either you've stopped it, you've put something in place so it doesn't happen so easily, or you've got insurance. Basically, it's going to be less expense for you. Another item that will be eliminated, an eliminated expense, is income losses due to the destruction of property, extra costs to maintain operations following a loss because there's going to be less chance that you have a loss, so hopefully you won't have a loss. Any adverse liability judgments may be avoided, so you won't even put yourself into the point where you're taken to court and sued and massive claims are given against you because you had good loss control measures put in place. Medical costs to treat injuries. Well, hopefully there's no injuries, so there's no medical cost. Income losses due to health or to death or disability. Well, hopefully you're not going to have any, or at least not as many, death or disabled members of staff through on-the-job activities. So let's look at some more potential benefits. Another potential quantifiable benefit of loss control is a reduction in the cost of other risk management techniques used in conjunction with the loss control. So an example is the decrease in insurance premiums that often accompanies a loss control investment. So you may put sprinklers in as part of your loss control system. And when you tell the insurance company, I've got a sprinkler system installed, they will actually reduce, or oftentimes they will actually reduce your insurance premium. There may be loss control benefits for which a dollar value cannot be easily estimated. So examples are going to include like the reduction in subjective risk that may accompany lower expected loss frequency and severity. So for example, if you don't have car insurance and then you decide to buy car insurance, even though there's a cost of car insurance, the actual cost to you, your subjective, or the benefit to you rather, the subjective benefit to you, what's the value of it? It may be a lot more than the actual value that you're paying the insurer for that. The second item there is improve public employee relations associated with fewer and less severe losses. So an example of that would be on a university campus that the administration decides to put more lights, to have more police around. So that may make people feel a lot safer, but again, it's difficult to actually put a dollar value on that feeling. But it definitely will make them more popular, make the school administration more popular with employees and the public and so on, and students. So what are the potential costs of loss control? It's usually easier to estimate the potential costs. Two obvious cost components are installation and maintenance expenses. Say, for example, a sprinkler system will have an initial cost to install and also will have ongoing expenses necessary to maintain it in proper working order. The challenge of cost estimation is often identifying all of the ongoing expenses. For example, if a security guard is hired, the cost will include not only the guard's salary, but also employee benefits and other variable expenses associated with employees. Also, some of the ongoing costs may merely be increases in other expenses. So, for example, utility bills may increase if a loss control measure draws on significant amounts of power to function. So, costs may come from indirectly. So, I've installed a new system to protect me from some things like fire or theft, but it takes up so much additional resource. I have to take those costs into account there as well. So these are potential costs that are going to come up. So an example. It's usually easier to estimate the potential costs associated with a loss control project than the potential benefits. Is that true or false? And the answer is true, based on what we just read. So I'll give you a quick example. Just go back here. I'll give you a quick example before I move on to the next slide. In 1993, Kentucky Fried Chicken, or KFC as they are called now, they were not investing any money in safety measures in any meaningful way. So the frequency and severity of losses were actually climbing, particularly in the slips and falls category. Over 50% of all accidents they had were slips and falls of employees and customers. And these injuries were adversely affecting their profitability. It was up to the risk management department to convince senior management that investment in safety was a legitimate way to increase profits. So a proposal was made and approved to set aside $1 million. In 1993, $1 million was more than obviously than it is now, to invest in safety on a 1-year trial basis, with risk management required to show the return on investment to obtain future funding. So if basically their scheme worked, that they would be able to continue it. What was the result? The first year, the initial investment of $1 million was paid back within 6 months for a tremendous 54% reduction in slip and falls. That resulted in corresponding reductions in payments for employee and customer injuries. So a company as big as KFC, 27 years ago, 1993, however long ago that was, they were practicing risk management. Let's look at risk retention. Risk retention is handling risk by bearing the results of risk rather than employing other methods of handling it, such as transfer or avoidance. That is, if a loss occurs, an individual or firm will pay for it out of whatever funds are available at the time. Is this a good policy? So let's look at this. Planned versus unplanned retention. So planned retention involves a conscious and deliberate assumption of recognized risk. Sometimes occurs because it is the most convenient risk treatment technique, or because there is simply no alternatives available short of ceasing operations. So again, with a medic may not want to buy insurance to cover them for medical malpractice, but they're going to lose their income, they're going to lose their job. If they don't want to do it, they're going to have to quit. So they've got no choice but to actually to take up insurance. But retaining the risk is not going to be a particularly good idea. But if there's no insurance, what are they going to do? So it gets a little bit complicated. Let's move on to the next one. So unplanned retention. Unplanned retention occurs when a firm or individual does not recognize that a risk exists and unwittingly believes that no loss could occur. Sometimes occurs even when the existence of a risk is acknowledged, and that's if the maximum possible loss associated with a recognized risk is significantly underestimated. So unplanned retention is I wasn't planning to keep this risk, and some way or another I was not aware that the risk existed. I was either totally oblivious to the risk existing, or I was aware of a risk, but I wasn't aware of how big that risk could be. I only thought it would be up to a certain amount, but it could be a lot more than that. So again, the amount that I was unaware of would be the unplanned. So an example is a manufacturer of kitchen appliances may recognize the potential for product liability lawsuits, but the potential size of adverse liability judgments may be much greater than the manufacturer anticipates. Juries and judges, especially juries, are awarding bigger and bigger claims, and it's very difficult to predict how large they're going to be. So even though the exposure is recognized, if the firm elects to purchase insurance based on its estimate of the maximum possible loss, it is engaging in unplanned retention of losses that exceed those estimates that it made. So let's look at funded versus unfunded. Unfunded retention is absorbing the expense of losses as they occur, rather than making any special advance arrangements to pay for them. So this may seem like a risky strategy. Many risk retention strategies involve the intention to pay for losses as they occur without making any funding arrangements in advance of a loss, and this is known as an unfunded retention. So, for example, a convenience food store may decide to absorb the expenses of shoplifting losses as they occur, rather than making any special advance arrangements to pay for them. Funded retention is pre-loss arrangements, is when pre-loss arrangements are made to ensure that money is readily available to pay for losses that occur. So you're like thinking ahead. So how about funded retention? How can it be funded? Well, one is through credit. So another one is through reserve funds that we've got here. So what does credit mean? So credit is when you get something like a line of credit to cover it. So it may provide some limited opportunities to fund losses that result from retained risk. It's usually not a viable source of funds for the payment of large losses. If you've got large losses running into the 10s and 20s and 30s and $50 million, credit may not be the best way to go about that. Unless the risk manager has already established a line of credit prior to the loss, the very fact that the loss has occurred, so if a loss does occur and they haven't put any credit into place, may make it impossible to obtain credit where needed. So, for example, Creditors may be unwilling to loan money to replace destroyed assets if those are the very assets that normally would have been used as collateral for that loan. And so let's look at reserve funds. So sometimes established to pay for losses arising out of risks a firm has decided to retain. When the maximum possible loss is quite large, and a reserve fund may not be appropriate. So again, for an individual company to keep these massive funds on hand may not be appropriate for many different reasons. It may impact severely on their operations. If they're not in the business of insuring themselves, they may not know how to deal with them. So it may not be appropriate. Let's look at an example. If the maximum possible loss due to a particular risk is relatively small, the existence of a reserve fund may be an efficient means of managing risk. So for example, a firm may set aside $5,000 in liquid assets to pay for periodic repair or replacement of office equipment. Thus, when a fax machine or a computer breaks down, the firm has funds readily available for the repair bill, which likely will be considerably less than the total reserve fund. When the maximum possible loss is quite large, however, a reserve fund may not be appropriate. If a small employer plans for, say, $50,000 reserve fund to pay for any hospital costs its employees incur, it has no way of knowing whether or not this fund is adequate. A single period of hospitalization for one employee could easily exhaust the savings, and the second period of hospitalization, before they've had a chance to replenish the $50,000, could be very bad because they won't have the money to actually pay for it. So let's look at this idea about self-insurance and captives. Self-insurance is when the firm basically insures itself. If the firm has no has a group of exposure units large enough to reduce risk and thereby predict losses, the establishment of a fund to pay for those losses is a special form of planned funded retention. So what we're talking about here is that a company needs to have a lot of information and a lot of data as well, a lot of exposure units, so it can predict what's going to happen. Insurance companies, because they insure lots of people, they have lots of data from everywhere, so they've got so much data, it's easier for them to predict. An individual company may not have a lot of claims, may not have a lot of exposure, and it may make it difficult for it to try and predict what's going to happen moving forward. So self-insurance does not involve a transfer of risk. The company retains all the risk. And the necessary elements of self-insurance are the existence of a group of exposure units. So you have to have data that is sufficiently large to enable accurate loss prediction. Pre-funding of expected losses through a fund specially designed for that purpose is also required. Some people object to the term self-insurance because the word insurance usually implies that a risk is transferred to another party. Self-insurance will not involve transfer of risk in this sense. Let's make sure that we are okay with that. Captive insurance. This is a type of insurer that is generally formed and owned by potential insureds to meet their own risk financial needs. So it's not self-insurance. You don't insure yourself directly within your company. You set up another company, a captive. You're the parent of the captive, and that's a little insurance company that you set up to insure you. There was massive tax breaks in this before, and the government felt that people were abusing it so they could take the tax breaks. They were setting up captives. So what happened is the government said that if you set up a captive, it's an insurance company, and 50% of your book, 50% of what you insure should be for people other than yourself. And that was trying to make sure people weren't setting it up just to save on taxes. So let's look at an example. Self-insurance usually involves risk transfer. Self-insurance does not involve risk transfer. That is a false statement. Let's look at decisions regarding retention. So, in any given situation, there are several factors to consider in assessing retention as a potential risk management technique. The factors include financial resources, ability to predict losses, and administrative issues, which we're going to look at here. So a large business can often use risk retention to a greater extent than can a small firm, in part because the large firm's greater financial resources, thus losses due to many risks may merely be absorbed as losses occurred without much advanced planning. So examples may include pilferage of office supplies, which is stealing things of little value. That's what pilferage means. Breakage of windows, burglary of vending machines. Let's look at the first of the 3 points, which are the financial resources. The following 8 elements from a firm's financial statements should, maybe not all of them, but they should and could be considered when choosing possible retention levels. So you can see them: total assets, total revenues, asset liquidity, cash flows, working capital, ratio of revenues to net worth, retained earnings, ratio of total debt to net worth. Now, for all of those items except the last one, the greater the number, the greater is the firm's ability to retain risk. So, say for example, the first one, total assets. The larger the value, the better it is for the company to be able to retain risk. And when we get to the last one, in the case of the ratio of total debt to net worth, firms with lower ratios are in a better position to fund risk retention than are those with higher ratios. So let's move on to the next page. So the second point, ability to predict and to predict losses. And I see a little mistake there. I'll correct it as we look at it here. Here you go. Okay, so the second point here is ability to predict losses. Although a firm may be able to retain the maximum probable loss associated with a particular risk, problems may result if there is considerable variability in the range of possible losses. So a company may say, I can actually deal with a $1 million loss. But if there's a lot of variation in the possible loss, it can be a million, but it could be 0 or it could be 50 million. There's so much variation that it may not be prudent to actually retain that loss. So if you can predict losses and there's not much variation, it makes it more likely for you to be able to retain the losses. And the third point, administrative issues. So if the decision to retain losses involves advance funding, administrative issues may need to be considered. What are you going to do with the money? You're retaining the money, and so how are you going to retain it? What are you going to do with it? How are you going to invest it? There's another issue which you'll come up across in other actuarial courses. It's the issue of matching assets to liabilities. So once I've got a lot of money, I have to set it aside in some way so it's available to pay claims as they fall due. So I have to predict when claims are going to fall due and also how big they're going to be. And then I have to find assets to actually invest the money in, which are going to mature or come to fruition at the time I expect to have losses. So there's a big administrative conundrum there. If the risk is likely to result in several losses over time, there will be administrative expenses associated with investigating and paying for those losses. So again, you're going to have to get maybe professionals in. You're going to have to keep track of them. You may have to get loss adjusters in to help you if you don't have the expertise. So there's going to be a lot of administration into getting all this stuff going and following through and tracking the claims. Administrative issues are of particular concern when a firm decides to set up self-insurance or a captive insurer arrangement, because pretty much you're taking on the insurance yourself, you're either keeping it in-house or you're setting up a subsidiary company of which you're the parent, and you have to have experts in there, so you're going to have to set up that company pretty well yourself. So a risk transfer involves payment by one party, the transferor, to another, the transferee or risk bearer. Transferee agrees to assume a risk that the transferor desires to escape. So just try and be familiar with the term. So it's like when you go and buy your car insurance, it's like you're the transferor, you want car insurance, you're going to pay the insurance company, and they're going to bear the risk. They're going to be the transferee, and they're going to bear the risk of you having an accident. So, hold harmless agreements. So these are also known as indemnity agreements. So these are provisions that are inserted into many types of contracts, including insurance contracts, where you can transfer responsibility for losses to a party different than the one that would otherwise bear it. So you can kind of shift the responsibility. The intent of these indemnity agreements is to specify the party that will be responsible for paying the various losses. Usually no dollar amount, no dollar limit is stated, but sometimes it is. But let me give you an example. So an example of a hold harmless agreement is that of, say, a landlord who includes a clause in his apartment leases making tenants responsible for all injuries that guests may suffer while on the premises. The transfer entails a shift in responsibility from for paying the losses, but there is no actual reduction in the original risk because the tenant's ability to predict losses is no greater than that of the landlord. It's just kind of shifting it. The risk is still there, it's just shifting it to somebody else. So hold harmless agreements, there's three forms that we have here. We have the limited form, the intermediate form, and the broad form. So the limited form basically just clarifies that all parties are responsible for liabilities arising from their own actions. So an example, let's take AAA construction company. Supposing it's building an office complex for Orion Inc., some other company. So AAA construction company, let's suppose it engages an electrical contractor to do electrical wiring in the buildings. The limited form hold harmless agreement between the construction company and the electrical contractor specifies that the electrical contractor is responsible for any liability losses arising from faulty wiring. The construction company is responsible for any other types of problems. So they're just like specifying who's responsible for what. In the absence of this agreement, it is possible that the construction company could be held responsible for faulty wiring losses because the construction company is the general contractor for the project. So you have to specify things in contracts, not just with insurance, in any contracts that we get involved in. So that's one form, the limited form, just basically saying, who pays what. They pretty much pay for their own actions. The intermediate form of hold harmless basically says that both are liable, but one agrees to pay. So the transferee agrees to pay for any losses in which both the transferee and transferor are jointly liable. So that's kind of interesting there, because they're both liable and one of them agrees to pay for it. So in the example I gave you above with the electrical contractor, supposing the electrical contractor is concerned that the construction company does not always adhere to building codes, and it may be that's going to cause it problems in its construction projects. Suppose that the contractor services are in considerable demand, and they don't want to be held up with lawsuits, and they don't want to get a bad reputation. Thus, before the electrical contractor agrees to do the electrical wiring, for the construction company, it insists that the construction company sign an intermediate form, hold harmless agreement, in which the construction company is the transferee and the electrical contractor is the transferor. Not only will the construction company have to pay for losses for which it is solely responsible, but it will also have to pay for any losses for which the electrical contractor and the construction company are judged to have both been at fault for. So that's another form, and it's just trying to give you some indication of why people would actually want to do that. They don't want to lose their reputation. They're working with somebody who's very shoddy on their work, so they say, you know what, you need to be responsible for this stuff. I don't want to lose my reputation or lose my livelihoods from it. And then the broad form of risk transfer, only one may be liable, and they can get the other one to pay. So it requires the transferee to be responsible for all losses arising out of a particular situation, regardless of fault. So let's see. Now, I'll continue with an example for this, but you may have probably guessed that these hold harmless agreements are not always legally enforceable. If the transferor is in a superior position to the transferee with respect to either bargaining power or knowledge of the factual situation, then an attempt to transfer risk through a hold harmless agreement may not be upheld by the courts, particularly true of the broad form of hold harmless agreement. So consider this example. Contracts between a candy manufacturer and its distributors may state that each distributor must assume the burden of paying for losses to consumers caused by problems with the candy. This clause constitutes a broad form hold harmless agreement through which the candy manufacturer attempts to transfer all risks associated with its product to the distributors, which doesn't seem fair. But what if the distributors are high school student groups selling the candy to make money for field trips? What if a defective ingredient causes hundreds of students to become ill after eating the candy? The inequality in knowledge and bargaining power between the manufacturer and the students likely will make the manufacturer's attempt to transfer such losses to the students' groups invalid. So if something happens and there's a lawsuit, I'm sure that the students' parents would sue the company and they would actually have to bear the risk. So, which of the forms of hold harmless agreement are least likely to be enforced by a court? The broad form, because the broad form is like can, if used incorrectly, somebody sets its liability on somebody else to pay. Now, if it's two willing parties that totally understand, then it may not be an issue. But when one party has power over the other, normal contract law says this as well. And I'm not an attorney, so I don't take what I say without getting consulting with a proper attorney. But normal contracts say when one party has a lot more power over the other party in a contract, then those contracts aren't always enforceable. So how can we transfer risk using an incorporation, or can we do it? The answer is yeah, we can. Another way for a business to transfer risk is to incorporate. The most that an incorporated firm can ever lose is the total amount of its assets. Personal assets of the owners cannot be attached to help pay for business losses, in contrast to sole proprietorships and partnerships. Through this act of incorporation, a firm transfers to its creditors the risk that it might not have sufficient assets to pay for losses and other debts. An example of this was in the 90s when Lloyd's of London, probably the world's largest reinsurance company. So when an insurance company buys insurance, they also want to transfer their risk. They don't want to hold all the risk. So they actually then insure again, which is called reinsurance, with another company. And typically a lot of those reinsurance contracts end up at Lloyd's in London. Lloyd's is made up of a number of syndicates. The insurance companies that work within Lloyd's are called syndicates. And the guys there, they didn't have any limited liability. They pledged their entire wealth as a guarantee for people insuring with them. And in the 90s, we had a big problem with asbestos claims coming in from the United States. These companies couldn't pay the claims. They didn't have enough reserves to pay the claims that were coming in. So they were looking at going after their personal wealth. And they didn't want that to happen, even though they pledged it and they made money for years under this system. And the whole structure of Lloyd's, first of all, they were bailed out by the government, and then they restructured them where the liability now that they have is limited. So let's look at risk transfer, diversification, hedging, and insurance. Diversification. The process of spreading risk through a firm's involvement in various businesses or through the location of its operations in different geographical areas is what diversification is. It results in the transfer of risk across business units. Having diversified business or geographical locations for one firm can result in the reduction of total risk through the portfolio effect of pooling individual risks that have different correlations. So, for example, if a firm with two production facilities may sustain windstorm damages to its facility in Nebraska resulting from a tornado, however, it is unlikely that the same storm would cause damage to its facility in Georgia. So if you actually split out your facilities, you can actually diversify your risk. Hedging. Hedging involves the transfer of speculative risk, and remember, speculative risk is like things on the stock market, somewhere where you're not really getting into it because you expect to make a gain, as opposed to pure risk where you either stay the same or you make a loss. Hedging involves the transfer of speculative risk, a business transaction in which the risk of price fluctuation is transferred to a third party, which can either be a speculator or another hedger. So, for example, an airline faces significant price risk from fluctuation in the price of the jet fuel that it buys. So the airline sells airline tickets well in advance of the date on which it promises to transport the passengers. The price that the airline pays for the jet fuel on the day that it transports its passengers may either increase or decrease. So because it's in the future relative to the price on the date that they actually sold the ticket. So it can actually you can use some sort of derivative instrument, and it can buy the fuel in advance. So it can lock into a price ahead of time. So they do guarantee themselves a particular price for the jet fuel. But so maybe they say they guarantee themselves a price of $10 per gallon of jet fuel. If on the date that they actually travel and they use that jet fuel, if the price is $12, it's great because they just saved, they're getting it for $10. But if the price falls to $6, they still have to pay $10 for it. That's what they locked into. So you could see it as they've lost $4 on it. Now, the most widely used of risk transfer is insurance, which we're going to talk about in a later chapter. The value of risk management. So this is economic justification for corporations managing systematic risk. So some elements of risk management can be viewed as positive net present value. If the expected gains from an investment in loss control exceed the expected costs associated with that investment, there may be an increase in the value of the firm. However, shareholders in a publicly traded corporation can eliminate firm-specific risk by holding a diversified portfolio of different company stocks. Therefore, the shareholder would appear to care little about the management of non-systematic or firm-specific risks that the shareholder can eliminate through portfolio diversification. This may make many risk management activities appear to have a negative net present value. However, many corporations engage in a number of activities directed at managing firm-specific risk. And so the question we're asking ourselves is, why is this economically justified? So in summary, we're saying that if the expected reduction in losses is greater than the cost to reduce those losses, then it can be seen as a positive thing for the company. But there's some investors that say, I don't want you spending money as an individual company trying to reduce your losses, or trying to reduce the possible losses you're going to get. I'd rather take a more risky approach, and I'll do the diversification myself, because I'm going to invest in 25 different companies, and some of them are going to make a loss and some of them are going to make a massive gain. So I see it as something negative. So then the question is, why is it that some companies still get involved in risk management, spending money on resources on risk management? So there was a paper, a journal article written by Mayer and Smith, and they've got 5 reasons indicating why companies may want to transfer risk and get involved with risk management. So the first one is insurance contracts and other forms of risk transfer can allocate risk to the firm's claim holders who have a comparative advantage in bearing risk. So, insurance companies, for example, have an advantage in bearing risk. They've got diversified portfolios, they've got more money, they've got more knowledge. 2, risk transfer can provide benefits by lowering the expected risk of bankruptcy. So obviously if you don't become bankrupt, that's obviously beneficial. So that's a good reason to be involved in risk transfer. 3, risk transfer increases the likelihood that the firm will meet its obligations to its debt holders and assures that funds will be available for future investment in valuable projects. So everyone's happy, the company keeps going, the shareholders are happy, and so on. 4, the comparative advantage of insurance in providing services related to risks can be advantageous for risk transfer through insurance, because insurance companies better know how to deal with claims handling and loss prevention and stuff like that, and they'll give you the benefit of their expertise. When the tax system is progressive, the additional tax from increases and earnings is greater than the reduction in taxes associated with decreases in earnings. Hence, risk transfer, by reducing the volatility of reported earnings, can reduce the firm's expected taxes. So, reducing the volatility, you're not going to have those big swings of high profits and low profits. You're going to have more of a stable amount of profits. And overall, this point seems to be suggesting that that may lead to lower taxation, a progressive taxation system. Seems to be saying that you're going to you're not going to make those massive big profits and pay the higher rates of taxation, but you're also not going to make the big losses. These are what these people put forward, and it's up to you if you agree with all their points or not. But there you go. The value of risk management. When evaluating risk management from the perspective of its impact on the value of the corporation, the source of the risk is less important than its effect on volatility. Regardless of whether the reduction in earnings comes from fire damage to the corporation, to the corporation's property, or from an increase in commodity prices, the financial impact on the shareholders is the same. So that's something to be aware of. A loss is a loss. It doesn't really matter where it comes from. So a broader view of risk underpins the movement towards enterprise risk management. So I want to manage all the risks. It doesn't matter where they come from. The holistic view reflects the realization that appropriate risk management must consider that the corporation faces a portfolio of risks. It's not just some little risk in isolation. It's a whole host of risks. Diversification within the portfolio of risks facing the corporation can alter the firm's risk profile. Ignoring these diversification effects by managing the firm's many risks independently can lead to an inefficient use of the corporation's resources. So we're interested in the full-on integrated risk management throughout the company, really. So let's look at this example. All of the following are reasons why a transfer of risk by a corporation is valuable, except which one is not. An insurance company can allocate risk to insurance companies who have a comparative advantage in risk bearing. Okay, so that seems to be okay. Insurance is usually less costly than self-insurance. That's not true. So remember, we're answering all of the following are reasons why a transfer of risk by corporation is valuable, except, well, yeah, insurance is usually less costly than self-insurance, and it's not. So that the answer is going to be B. Look at another example. The concept of enterprise risk management or integrated risk management suggests that diversification has little relevance to risk management, and that is false. Diversification is part of risk management. So integrated risk management, the enterprise-wide view of risk management encompasses building a structure and systematic process for managing all of the corporation's risks. It considers all the risks: financial, commodity, credit, legal, environmental, reputational, and all the risks. The formation of a new-ish position for some firms of chief risk officer reflects a realization of the importance of identifying all the risks that could negatively impact the firm. And some, but not all of the responsibilities of the chief risk officer include implementation of a consistent risk management framework across the organization's business areas, implementation and management of an integrated risk management program, communications of risk, and the integrated risk management program to stakeholders, and mitigation and financing of risks. So there's a lot of different aspects. So integrated risk management, I'm looking at the entire company's operation, and I'm trying to manage the risk in many, many different ways. You can avoid risk, all the things that we looked at. You can pass risk on to other people. You can have agreements with other people to carry part of the risk, whether it's somebody you're doing, like it's a subcontractor or whoever it is, or whatever you want to do. There's so many different ways to do it. You can retain the risk yourself, self-insure. You can have a captive. There's many different things that you can actually go for. So then we have the summary, the main points of the chapter, and then we have the key terms and concepts yet again.